Welcome to this edition of the Beef Roundtable. This month, we will explore the topic of how maternal nutrition affects fetal development and subsequent offspring performance. I'm Dr. Ron Lemonade, your beef extension specialist at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. The Beef Roundtable is available as a video at both the Beef Magazine and www.beefroundtable.com websites. And it's also available as a downloadable MP3 at beefroundtable.com.
And I'm Bert Rutherford, Senior Editor at Beef Magazine. Our first guest for this edition of the Beef Roundtable is Dr. Ron Scott. Ron grew up on a diversified farm in north central Indiana, where he and his family raised cattle and swine, row crops, and hay. Ron holds a bachelor's in animal science from Purdue University and a master's and Ph.D. from Oklahoma State University. His graduate work in beef cow supplementation led him to a career with Purina Animal Nutrition, where he is director of beef research. His focus there is developing life cycle supplementation strategies that increase animal performance as well as produce profitability.
Our second guest is Dr. Kim Van Ame. She was born and raised on a grain and livestock farm in west central Iowa. She studied animal sciences as an undergraduate at Iowa State University, moved to Oklahoma State University for her master's, and then on to the University of Wyoming for her Ph.D. In 2004, she joined the faculty at North Dakota State University to work on placental vascularity in the beef cow. The long-term objective of her research is to produce healthy pregnancies that will allow the offspring to optimize their potential. The overall concept is to study developmental programming during gestation on subsequent offspring productivity.
Ron and Kim, we're here now about things such as fetal programming, lactational programming, and developmental programming, not only in the research community, but amongst beef producers as well. Give our audience a historical background on these concepts and why they've become such an active area, not only within the research area, but amongst beef producers as well.
Yeah, that's right, Bert. And a lot of the information that comes to us from the livestock side actually originated with humans. Now we know we can't do research on humans. If we do, it's kind of frowned upon, but what we do on the humans is look at what's called epidemiological information. So they look at groups of people on some of the influences of their life and compare it to others. And what they found was a doctor in England, his name was David Barker. He found that there was a relationship between low birth weight babies. They died early, but their siblings, when they became adults, had a very, very high incidence of coronary heart disease. And so that began this whole emphasis around what we call today fetal programming. And it led to some more work looking at something that was characterized as the Dutch hunger winter, something the Dutch winter hunger, which was during World War II in Amsterdam in 44, 45. The Nazis actually barricaded the city, blockaded the city. There's no food going in. And so the city had to ration the amount of food or calories that they had. Well, it was about a 3-month time period. And 3 months is approximately 1 trimester. So there were ladies who were already pregnant when this hunger shortage occurred. And then there were ladies who became pregnant either in the first or second trimester. So they followed the children who were born from these ladies who had differences, whether they had shorted nutrition first, second, or third trimester, and they found that different diseases actually occurred in those kids when they became adults. And so, for example, coronary heart disease is common for those who had poor nutrition. Moms had poor nutrition in the first trimester, second trimester, had things like glucose intolerance, third trimester, more lung issues and things like that. So all these different diseases occurred because of the developmental period was compromised. And because of that, a lot of emphasis now has been placed on livestock. And so folks like Dr. Van Ame are aggressively working towards that area to help us out.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, livestock producers have known from a really long time that if you have a low birth weight animal, they're going to be poor doers, and they're going to take a little bit extra effort to help them get over the hump. And we know too sometimes even with twinning. So in sheep or even in cattle, those twins, they've had to share all that nutrition while they were inside mom, and so that their growth trajectories are hindered a little bit as well. So in the past, we've known this, and producers have been very astute to know that there's certain things that go on that could impact their livestock growth after they're born. But it was because of David Barker that really put a name on it and really gave us a thing to study. So we've been looking at that in our livestock species as well.
So let's spend a little time talking about what happens between conception and birth in terms of the maternal side of that pregnancy. And can you develop a timeline of what you think might be critical tissue development on the maternal side? And then we'll follow that, and then we'll come back with the fetal side here in just a minute. But let's talk about the mom side of the equation.
Okay, so there's a few things that have to happen to mom. One of the first things that happens is the mom, during the activation of being pregnant, actually she has a plasma volume expansion or blood volume expansion ultimately, which is going to be so that she can nurture this offspring. So one of the things that we talk about, which is better documented in women actually than animals, is that there is a 20 to 30% increase in blood volume. So not only do you have to keep blood going to the mom's kidneys and her adrenal glands and all of her body organs, but she has this growing calf inside, and she needs to provide enough nutrients and blood to this developing uterus. So her uterus is going to expand, and the placenta within that uterus is also going to expand. The cow is unique from the standpoint that placental development is going to continue to occur all the way throughout pregnancy, which is a little different than the sheep. The uterus and the placentomes inside of the placenta inside reach a peak weight, and then they actually slightly decrease in size. But the cow is going to continue to increase as gestation advances. The other thing that's taking place is we know pregnancy affects the maternal GI tract or her guts, and that they're going to become more vascular, so she can extract more nutrients out of her diet, out of her intake. That way it gets into her bloodstream and ultimately can get to the calf with the developing uterus. And then lastly, in the cow, we see towards the very end of gestation, her mammary gland is really going to take off, and we've all seen this towards the end of gestation. We notice how much fuller the udder becomes, and so that's because the mammary gland is going to be taking over after the calf is born. The mammary gland is now going to produce the nutrition that calf is going to need, and we know that if mom's not adequately fed during the last third of pregnancy in particular, that we could influence the ability for that mammary gland to fully differentiate and be able to produce.
And I want to touch on one thing that she mentioned about the placenta. One thing we need to recognize as an industry is that this placenta is what feeds the fetus. And when it is formed properly, that means that it's going to have more arteries and veins, capillaries, so that it can provide a blood flow to the developing fetus. So that's where that little fetus gets all of its nutrition from, is from the placenta. And if stress or undernutrition occurs, then guess what? That placenta does not form properly, and therefore you can have reduction in blood flow or literally reduction in nutrients going to the fetus. So that first trimester is pretty critical because that's when that placenta is formed. And the thing for us to remember, cattlemen, is very simply this: that placenta is the hotel and room service for that little calf. And if you don't have good room service or good hotel, it doesn't work very well. So from the common sense standpoint, we need to remember, although that first trimester is where you got a little bitty fetus, little embryo in there, there's a lot of things going on for mama that really influence it.
Good point. So when you look at the trajectory, well, the fetal trajectory and weight of the baby exponentially goes up towards the end. Ron's right. It's the placenta that's growing exponentially early.
Now that's a excellent description of what's going on with the cow, what's going on with mom. Now, give us some indication on what are the critical periods during gestation. Ron, you mentioned that just a little bit. Let's go into that just a little bit deeper. What are those critical periods, and why are they important?
Yeah, well, I think that I'll take it from a general common sense standpoint. I think everybody can kind of appreciate this. If you're building a house, you want to have a good foundation. You don't want to skimp on materials. You skimp on materials or quality, you don't get as good a house. And then you can have some structural problems after a few years. It's the same way in animals, same way in people. When we start to develop, that whole process is very important. And there are different steps in that process. And if we compromise those steps, then we're in trouble. So, for example, the first trimester, we just mentioned the placenta, but that's when you've got brain, the heart, the liver, and other organs that are differentiating, which means they're just coming into their own and they're starting to develop. And if we compromise those at that stage, then guess what? There's a permanent effect after that individual is born. Then you get into the rest of the trimesters, like second trimester, when muscle tissue starts to be created. So we have a finite number of muscle fiber cells that are created before we're born. After you're born, you don't get more muscle. You can make muscle bigger, but you don't get more muscle fibers. So any stage during gestation that impacts developmental programming influences lifetime performance of animals, particularly here what we're talking about is cattle.
And then just to add on to that, we know that when we look at fertility of our livestock, so if you're looking for heifer development or selection of bulls, those gonads are actually developing within that first trimester as well. So even though they seem very small, that gonad that's in that fetus is developing very, very early in life when it's inside mom.
So do you have a feel for the different tissues? Okay, Ron, you kind of mentioned, muscle tissue, okay, and the number of muscle fibers. That typically happens kind of towards the latter part of gestation. Is that right?
Well, the second trimester is when the muscle fibers actually begin to differentiate it and are created, and then it continues into that third trimester. But in that third trimester, you are influencing the end of the creation of those muscle fiber cells, but you're also influencing the size. So you got two things going on. So, and that would be true of any tissue or organ that's developed. You are creating it, and then you're influencing the size or how well it's going to perform. Yeah, so it's two things. So, and the interesting thing is this. Kim mentioned that the gonadal development. So we've got our germ cells or ovary, testes, and things like that. Here's the interesting thing. There's information that shows that the first trimester nutrition or stress influences reproduction. But there's also information that says that third trimester influences fertility too. So it's not only when those organs are being developed or created, it's the entire life cycle within the uterus before that calf is born, that at any stage you can influence it. Yeah.
Right. So just to add, while you anatomically can see a little ovary or a little testicle, all the way that the body's going to talk to each other and communicate with each other is an ongoing process. And I like Ron's analogy of this foundation. If you don't get the foundation right, you're not going to be building on top of it. So, so I think that's important to note that while we can structurally see these things at specific time points in pregnancy, it doesn't mean it's all working together yet. And some of that's going to occur even during postnatal life. But we see that that foundation is really set while that calf is in utero.
Well, and your comments are kind of really interesting because I think historically most of the nutritionists and producers have kind of focused on that last trimester, okay? When that calf is growing exponentially, that's when most of the weight takes place. And maybe secondarily in that early lactation phase, right? So, when we think about putting nutrient requirements, together and formulating diets, from the discussion that we've had so far, I think it's safe to say that nutrition during early and mid phases may be a whole lot more important than a lot of us have ever thought, right? I mean, with the evolving data set. So let's now talk about how cow nutrition during the first, second, and third trimesters could have maybe a positive or a negative effect. And we've kind of alluded to some of that here just a minute ago. But, is there anything else that we can add to that in terms of those 3 different trimesters of pregnancy and its effect on subsequent performance during the lifetime of that offspring that's developing in utero?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and that's a question a lot of producers ask, because if there's the most critical time, when is that most critical time that I need to make sure that nutrition is adequate, or we provide something in addition to make sure we can get over this negative time point if something's not there. And so it depends on what you are interested in, the phenotype which you're interested in. But mostly, let's just talk about carcass development. So even though we know critically we need to set a good foundation, there's been several researchers across the U.S. and even different parts of the world that have shown if we're just interested in postnatal growth or carcass weight, the first trimester may not be that critical. We're not going to see changes in that phenotype directly. It's when we start talking about mid-pregnancy and late pregnancy, and sometimes it's really difficult to pinpoint the exact day because there's like this overlaying time, right? So not everybody's doing this on the same day. But if we do look at feeding adequately or knowing we can, if for some reason there's not enough nutrition during mid-pregnancy, we know we can start affecting the birth weight, we're affecting weaning weights, we're affecting carcass weights, and there's even been some labs showing that we're affecting the tenderness of that beef. And then there's more data to show that during the last trimester, we can influence marbling of that carcass. So there's kind of this continuum. And again, the phenotype, if we look at just carcass outcomes of that offspring, I would then hedge to say mid to late pregnancies are your most critical times. But there could be other phenotypes we're interested in, like heifer development or fertility of the offspring, which in my mind needs just to be studied more. I don't think the data is there's not enough data out there to rule it out yet. We do know that fertility in heifer calves, that last trimester is important, but I think we need to step that back and look at fertility based off of maternal nutrition during early and mid-pregnancy as well.
Yeah, and to follow up on what Dr. Van Alme commented on, how do we apply that to our cow herd to ensure that we're doing the right thing for the cows? Well, think about this. How many days of the year is that cow eating just for herself? Think about that. How many days a year is she eating just for herself? Well, if you're managing your cows based on recommendations, there should be 0. She's either pregnant, she's either lactating and pregnant, or she's pregnant and lactating and eating for herself too. She's eating for 2 or 3 every day of the year. And because of that, we have so much maternal stress throughout the year when she's pregnant. So think about this. You have to work backwards when your cows are calving. So if your cows are spring calving cows, what did they just go through? They just went through a tough winter. What happens in the winter? Cows lose weight. That's not good for the developing fetus. If you're calving in the fall, what just happens? Heat stress in the summertime. Nutrient flow is diverted away from the fetus, and it's towards heat stress, making the heart beat more fast, trying to dissipate all the heat. So there are all kinds of environmental stressors every season that cows have. Right? So it's a tough world for a mama cow that's pregnant. So whatever we can do to help ensure that she has a consistent plate of nutrition is very positive. So think about that. You know, if you go outside and it's pretty cold out, you're not feeding the cows, forage quality may not be as good as it should be. Well, is that the right decision? Probably not. You need to feed them.
I think that's an excellent caveat to all the rest of this, okay, is that, you know, the consistency of a plane of nutrition becomes maybe more important than we ever thought. You know, producers kick cows out on corn stalks and they may or may not supplement, all right, during that second trimester of pregnancy, and there may be some consequences to that kind of a management strategy, okay, without proper supplementation. And that's not just energy and protein, but I think we've got some data that exists that mineral nutrition is also another piece. And we typically think about supplementing energy and protein, right? But minerals, and so any comments on that?
So I'm just a physiologist, but I have a growing appreciation for these minerals and vitamins. It actually kind of blew my mind when even some trace minerals, which we've done a lot of work at NDSU looking at selenium and the effects of the soils in North Dakota and parts of South Dakota are very rich in selenium. And we're seeing that in our sheep models anyway, we have not done this in beef yet, could potentially be protective when nutrient availability might be lowered. So those are some things that we're continuing to investigate. So that trace mineral is of great interest to us up here. But yeah, there is other work in other species with that. But I'll turn over to the nutritionist so he can add a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so one thing we need to remember is that there are biological processes across species that are what we call conserved, which means if something is true in pigs, it's true in cows, it's true in humans. And one of those is this demand for nutrients by the fetus creating the placenta. And you think about humans, if my wife gets pregnant or a lady becomes pregnant, what's the first thing the doctor tells her to do? Well, she goes out and you're supposed to buy vitamins because there are missing nutrients for that fetus, particularly folic acid. And if you apply that to the cow herd in the U.S., what's the first thing that a cattleman does when his cows get pregnant? Nothing, right? So as an industry, we probably need to think about that paradigm, think about, well, am I going to do anything different for my cows now that it's breeding season? They just got pregnant, or I'm trying to get them bred? Because there's a lot of information out there across species that says this time period is pretty vital for the development of that fetus. So the trace minerals is important. I think the challenge we have in the industry with mineral nutrition is we tend to think that, well, I don't need to have it out there every day. You know, it gets wet. I don't need to replace it, or they'll eat it. Remember that little fetus is growing every day needs nutrition every day, just like a pregnant lady, her little baby needs nutrition every day too. So it's the same thing. So we need to think about that.
You know, this conversation kind of made me think about, you know, the beef cow with a 9-month pregnancy. All right, we expect her to calve every 12 months. The beef cow compared to other species, okay, is a little bit more challenging, I think, because, you know, some of the other species, sheep, pigs, could have some breaks, okay, and where they are truly run, as you kind of described, just feeding themselves, all right? But the beef cow is always multitasking, right? In terms of nutrient flow and physiology, and that's kind of an important point that I think, you know, sometimes we don't think about.
If I could just interject there too, one thing that we've talked about in our lab is competition. So when that cow is not only has a calf beside her suckling, but one inside, that uterus and that mammary gland have to compete for nutrients in order for which way those nutrients are going to be diverted. And I think sometimes we don't think about that enough either. So we're continuing to make sure that we provide not only what she needs for her maintenance, but then also how to make sure lactational performance is good, and then also that we have adequate nutrition going to that developing calf.
You know, we talked about minerals and some things like that, but looking at it from a cattle producer's perspective, and looking at first, second, third trimester, is it more an issue of just general undernutrition, or providing an adequate plan of nutrition throughout pregnancy, or are there other specific nutrients that are really a concern?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that and then let Dr. Benami take over with some of the work they're trying to get done. What we is a little bit, so in the future we'll know a lot more. So in general, we'd say that the total plane of nutrition or daily nutrition during those different stages of gestation is important. Most of the data that has been collected has been with eating a balanced diet, just less of it, with the exception of some work that's been done in Nebraska where they're looking at feeding more supplemental protein that last trimester. And it does show that there's a positive influence there with protein supplementation. But in a way that's confounded, which means we don't know if it's because of the protein or simply because when you feed protein to a cow and forage, they actually eat more forage and you get a higher energy consumption that way too. So it's a combination of protein and energy. And common sense says that protein, energy, vitamins, and minerals are all very important, no matter whether you're a human or a cow. But we know that protein is very important and energy is important because those are the two major macro nutrients that dictate who we are, how we live, our body condition, whether or not we have muscling or not. Cows, they go through the winter. If they don't have enough energy, well, they have to use their muscle, which is protein. They have to use that muscle for energy. So that's when they start losing an extreme amount of weight. So anyway, all of those are important, but there is some data that shows that protein nutrition seems to be vital that last trimester.
And Dr. Scott, I think our work here, just recent work at NDSU, where we've tried to mirror some of the data that's come out of Nebraska, shows if we supplement more protein, we have a feeding system so we can monitor individual feed intake. We do increase, those cows not only get more protein, but they consume more. So their total energy is increased. And we see in those particular cows that when we do that, we can increase uterine blood flow to those calves.
I think we've pretty well established that fetal programming is probably a pretty important concept for producers to kind of think about. And, do we have any data that would suggest that there might also be a lactational programming effect? So we talked about kind of what's going on, before the calf is born, but what happens shortly after that calf is born? Does that have any influence on the future productivity of that calf?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been some beautiful work that's come out of Auburn that shows in pig that what that piglet consumes, what's in that colostrum, the early milk that piglet is suckling, can influence that gilt's fertility. And there's been some really great work in that area. So what is in cow's milk and how that gets to the offspring, I'm assuming this is one of those things that Dr. Scott talked about. There's surely things that are going to cross species. So what is in cow's milk, how much that young calf gets up and suckles early in life probably does matter. Just to look at amount of milk that the mom is making, we do know that we can influence milk production in the same model where we fed greater levels of protein to cows. We can increase the amount of colostrum they make as well as then the amount of milk they make. The big components, the amount of fat and lactose and protein in that milk doesn't differ on a per milliliter or per ounce basis, but they just have more of it. But surely there's things that we're not measuring yet, like they've done in the pig, that shows there's certain things in that milk that can enhance development of the offspring. So I think that's a new venture that we should get into.
There's some information, a lot more than there used to be relative to milk. You know, when I'm growing up, I know that milk gives me calcium and makes my bones grow. Well, we know that milk provides protein, it provides fats, vitamin D, and there's also some sugar in milk called lactose. But the rest of the story is there's a lot of compounds in milk that people didn't know about 20 years ago that we're just discovering now that actually influence the health and well-being of the newborn and then through their development when they're suckling. So it's very critical. The one thing that our cattlemen need to know, and they probably know this, but it's always good to point it out, there's an enormous amount of data that was created around 20 years ago, 25 years ago, showing that cows that are in better body condition produce more milk, and therefore you can increase weaning weight simply because your cow's calf in better shape. Well, to get that cow in better shape, that means that she probably maintained body condition better during the last trimester, right? So you're not only you're influencing fetal development, but milk production. So some of the benefits that have been shown relative to fetal programming are also because that cow is in a better plane of nutrition and will also produce more milk, which would help the weaning. So it's two things, it's milk production and fetal programming, and now with some of the information coming out on what on earth is going on with lactation programming, and there's all kinds of stuff that we're just figuring out that we can look at to see how we can improve the health and well-being of these calves.
And I think, to add to what you just said, Ron, just a real simple example that I think producers can kind of relate to, and that's colostrum consumption, right? And we've got some pretty good data, that exists in the literature that says that if a calf doesn't get adequate colostrum consumption, as a baby calf, it's not only affecting that early calf life in terms of its ability to ward off infections and disease challenges, but it lingers beyond that passive immunity phase into the feedlot and health in the feedlot. That's not passive immunity anymore. That's kind of a programming of that calf for a general immune response to disease challenge later in its life. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally would. I think that it's kind of mirrored. I think that when we start looking about how mom's not done taking care of that offspring until weaning time, and so there's surely things that are going on not only in utero, but then hopefully there's some intervention since then. So maybe there's some adaptations by the mammary gland and its ability to nutrients. But yeah, that calf could be down the same trajectory depending upon not only what mom was fed in utero or what mom was fed while she was pregnant, but then during early lactation. And yeah, I think there's nobody who would doubt that those effects continue to linger on all the way until more as that animal ages.
Let's take the discussion from the feedlot back to the pasture, and I think it's fascinating that we see those implications, if you will, show up in cattle on feed, and also even into from those heifers, even into their calves, into that second and third generation. So let's take that back to the pasture. What recommendations have you got relative to the management of the cow in terms of her nutrition during gestation as well as early lactation? And then what are the real critical times if you're a cattle producer out there needing to walk that line between how do I do right by the cow and how do I do right by the checkbook and the banker? What are the real critical times there in terms of making sure that your cows are receiving the nutrition that both they and the fetus need.
Yeah. Well, I think, 20 years ago we'd say, well, it's all about the last trimester. After this presentation, we know that first and second trimester is very important too. So it's actually every day of the year. So what we have to do as cattlemen is to monitor our cows, monitor their nutrition. Well, how do you do that? Well, you look at their body condition and you try to ensure that they're not losing weight. If you see your cows every day, you don't see that they're losing weight. So, it helps to have somebody else look at them every now and then also. But I think back to humans again. If my wife is pregnant and she's losing weight, guess what? She's going to the hospital or she's in bed during pregnancy. We have so many cows across the U.S. that lose weight during pregnancy, and that influences the health and well-being lifetime performance of the offspring. So, what we have to try to do is figure out how can I keep cows in a more consistent plane of nutrition so that those time periods when they were losing weight, they don't anymore. Hopefully we can get them to be in a maintenance mode during those bad times of the year. And then when they need to gain weight, springtime after it's done, you get some good lush grass growing, then you can pick up conditions. So we like to tell folks that it really makes a lot of sense to think about your cows every day, try to make sure they don't have a bad day, and that really can influence the calf crop. But if you think about, for a long time period, you say, well, what is the most important? There was a study a couple years ago, a dairy study, that looked at heat stress. Dairy cows either have heat stress and also have fans and mitches on them. And then what they looked at was the heifers that were born from that, and then what kind of mamas they made. And guess what? Those heifers that were born to dams that had most heat stress produced more milk, dramatically more milk, so like a gallon more a day. So it's a night and day influence every day of the year on the development of the calf. And whether it's going to become a replacement heifer or whether they're going to go to the feed yard, it really influences everything from muscle production, carcass weight, tenderness, heifers, fertility. It's just unbelievable. And so we just need to keep that in mind and try to keep those cows in a consistent plan of nutrition every day of the year.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think one thing that's a little tricky is, when you look at body condition score and just some of the experiments or the studies we've done with cattle, they're pretty amazing animals. They're going to mobilize a lot to make sure that those calves are doing fine. And oftentimes we have models where we know we're not feeding them adequately and blood flow is decreasing, so the nutrients that are going to that calf are dropping, but we don't see that big of a spread in condition score. So I think sometimes it's good to catch it early if you can, have those nutrients available to your dams. I don't think you want to wait until you really see that noticeable change in the body condition of mom. And that's tricky. I think that's sometimes tricky because I get it. You want to make sure you're watching your checkbook and you're doing those things. And I think we just need to keep doing research. It's, like a precision agriculture thing. If we know exactly the right time and the right thing to feed, that's going to be the best thing. And we still have a lot of work to do to figure that out. But in the meantime, I agree with Dr. Scott. We need to make sure that we have good things available to mom at all times, because if we let her slip too far, there could be some detrimental outcomes.
One of the things I'm just going to follow up, Ron, with a comment that you made about, when you see these cows every day, and I've got cows too, okay, and so I see them every day, and you don't see them change in condition score when you look at them that frequently. You're better off if you can step back for a week and then come back in and look at them. So what I tell producers and my students in class is that, pick a group of cows that represent your cow herd. So you got some young cows, you got some old cows, you got some kind of prime age cows, some big ones, some little ones. But pick a group of cows that represent your cow herd, and then once a month, make it a choice that you go out and you find that handful of cows and use them as your barometer. And quite honestly, probably the best barometer, if they're being group fed together, is the young cow in the group, because she's going to be the most sensitive model, okay, of what's going on in plain nutrition. And so there's ways to kind of get around that, but you've got to make a conscious decision that you're going to look at your condition score in your cows and not all of a sudden one day walk out there and say, oh man, what happened? You know, and sometimes we get caught in that. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a good recommendation. And the key point on that is you have to write it down. So you've got the group that you're looking at, the different times of the year, but unless you write it down, you can't see any trend. So, you know, they were 5.5 in December, and then in April they were 5, in June they were 6. You don't really remember throughout time what was going on, particularly if you got a group where they're fairly consistent. So it's important to write it down so you can see those trends. You know, one thing that we try to do, some people don't get out and do that as often maybe as they should. So we try to give a recommendation. You're not going to do it every month. At least try to get it before crucial times of the year. So you want to get something done right before calving. You want to get something during the breeding season, kind of mid-year, during that late part, right before you wean, and then going into the winter also. So those times of the year tend to be the crucial areas relative to environment, what's going to happen next. And like Bert mentioned, you got to plan, because you got feed costs and supplementation costs. You don't have enough forage. What on earth are you going to do? Well, if you know that your cows are sloughing body position, they're going down, and you have to buy hay, well, you better buy better hay this year than you did the year before, because if they're in poor condition, then that hay resource is really critical. So monitoring conditions, understanding your feed resources will really help you manage your wallet.
You know, and it seems to me, Ron, you know, everybody has one of these. And you can take a pretty decent picture with your cell phone. Seems to me this could be a pretty handy tool in monitoring body condition. Just as you're out there looking at the cows, take a picture or two, and then look at that in addition to the records that you keep. Would something like that work?
You can. However, one of the challenges we have when you take pictures of cattle are shadows, and it's hard to tell body condition sometimes from the details from a picture, particularly if they're black cattle, because of the shadows. But at the same time, you can easily tell, you know, condition score 4 from a 6. It's sometimes a little more difficult to tell a 5 from a 5.5, for example, with the camera. But in general, you're exactly right. You can take a picture of a group and kind of get an idea of what's going on. So that's a good recommendation.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Beef Roundtable. Bert and I would like to thank our guests, Dr. Kim Vanami and Dr. Ron Scott, for sharing their insights and experience with fetal programming in the beef cow. Please join us again next month for another Beef Roundtable discussion.